Shipwrecked. A long time ago in Jerusalem, there lived a religious leader called Paul. Paul didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. He did everything he could to hurt Jesus' followers, but after God spoke to Paul on the road to Damascus, his life changed forever. From that time on, Paul travelled from place to place, teaching the scriptures and telling people about Jesus. But many religious leaders in Jerusalem didn't believe Jesus was the promised Messiah like Paul now did. They wanted Paul to stand trial for teaching lies. They said to each other, "We must stop him as soon as possible." To keep Paul safe from the religious leaders, a group of Roman soldiers took him to Caesarea. Paul stood before the governor, Festus. "Caesar will decide if I stand trial, not these religious leaders," he said. Festus agreed. "You have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you go." Festus handed Paul and a group of prisoners over to a Roman officer named Julius, whose job it was to take the prisoners to Rome by ship. The ship left Caesarea. Below deck, the prisoners crowded together and talked about Paul. "I heard they sent hundreds of soldiers to arrest him," one man said. "He must be a real troublemaker." The prisoners nodded their heads. Everyone knew the religious leaders hated Paul because he taught people that Jesus was the Son of God. At the port, Julius strode up and down inspecting the ships. He frowned at the dark grey clouds. "I need to find a bigger ship." "I have a group of soldiers and prisoners," Julius shouted up to the ship's crews. "Does anyone have room on their freighter?" "We have space," said a captain. He hurried down to meet Julius. Julius bought tickets and marched Paul and the prisoners onto the ship. The captain wanted to leave quickly. "Untie the ropes," he ordered. "We're sailing to Rome." The ship left port and sailed towards Rome, but the weather changed and the winds began to blow harder and harder. Paul and Julius stood on the deck and stared at the sky. "I don't like the look of those clouds," said Julius. The ship crawled through the water as slow as a snail. "This wind is too strong," the captain shouted to the sailors. "Let's sail towards Crete and find shelter from the storm." More clouds rolled across the sky and the winds blew even harder. No matter how hard the sailors worked, they couldn't sail any faster. A few days later, the ship crept into harbour on the Isle of Crete. Paul strode over to the captain. "If we sail on, this trip will end in disaster." The captain wouldn't listen to Paul. "Leave it to us to sail this ship. We know what we're doing," he said. "If we stay in the harbour, we can avoid the winter storms," argued Paul. "Why don't we leave for Rome when the seas are calm?" But the captain had made up his mind to sail to Phoenix. "We can stay there for the winter if the weather is bad," he told Paul. Paul just shrugged and sighed. The next morning the ship set sail. The captain stood at the back of the boat. "Don't worry," he told Paul. "I've made the right decision." But as the ship sailed, the winds turned into howling gales. Paul gripped the railings and watched the black clouds roll toward the ship. "We're heading for trouble," he thought. Monster waves began pounding the ship and winds tore across the bow. "If the storm continues, the ship will sink," cried the captain. The sailors' hearts pounded with fear. The next morning the captain made a decision. "This ship is too heavy," he shouted. "Throw the cargo overboard." Quickly, Paul and the prisoners grabbed heavy sacks of corn and grain and dumped them into the water. "Throw the rigging overboard," yelled the sailors. They tossed the ropes and chains into the sea too. Thunder boomed overhead and lightning streaked across the sky. "We're all doomed," the sailors cried. They were too seasick to steer the ship. "They'll never make it to Rome alive." The men lay on the deck, clutching their stomachs. They were too sick to eat or say anything. "Don't worry," said Paul. He turned to the captain. "A messenger from God told me I must stand before the Roman emperor. This ship will be driven ashore onto an island, but God will save us." The captain clung to the mast of the swaying ship and nodded. "I hope Paul is right," he muttered. "Anything is better than sailing through this terrible storm." The crew began to give up hope of ever being saved. On the 14th night, the men heard a strange noise. Was that the sound of waves crashing on rocks? They jumped to their feet and stared into the darkness. A sailor tossed a rope over the side to see how deep the water was. 120 feet, he yelled. A little further he dropped it again. 90 feet. The crew cheered. They were near land. Worried the ship would smash onto the rocks, the captain shouted, "Drop the anchors! We'll stay here till dawn!" The sailors pushed the anchors overboard and the ship came to a shuddering stop. The captain breathed a sigh of relief. His boat was safe. Just before dawn, Paul gathered the men together on the deck. "Please eat something," he said. "You need to stay strong. God has promised to save your lives. No one will die." The men's stomachs grumbled loudly. Nobody had eaten for days. Paul took some bread, blessed it, and began to eat. As dawn broke, the men finally saw land. "See that strip of sand?" the captain told the sailors. "Steer the ship towards that." The sailors quickly obeyed. They cut off the anchors and untied the oars, and the ship lurched forward through the crushing waves. Crunch! The ship crashed into a rocky reef and began to tear apart on the rocks. "Let's get out of here," said the sailors. They swam toward the beach as fast as they could. Paul and the prisoners dived into the sea and swam to the sandy beach. They couldn't wait to reach dry land. Just as God had promised, everyone reached the shore safely. They had arrived on the island of Malta. They made a huge bonfire on the beach so the men could get warm. Paul and the men crowded round the roaring fire. They were so happy to be warm and dry again. Paul quietly thanked God for saving their lives. As Paul stood by the fire, a poisonous snake slithered towards him and bit him on the hand. "This man must be a murderer," cried the locals. "He survived the shipwreck, but he won't survive a snake bite." Paul just tossed the snake into the fire without being hurt. Everyone was amazed. "He must be a god," they said. "How else could he still be alive?" Publius, the governor of Malta, gave the man a place to stay. When Paul found out that Publius' father was sick, he prayed and asked God to heal him. After this, many people came to Paul to be healed. Everyone treated him with respect, and many gave him gifts. 3 months later, the captain was ready to leave for Rome. Paul hurried down to the dock and boarded the ship. He had enjoyed helping the people of Malta, but God wanted him in Rome. It was time to stand before Caesar, the mighty Roman Empire.